Not doing long-winded introductions this week. We've got lots of content and speakers to get through, so I'm going to turn it over to you. Very excited to have you with us all the way there in California, and I understand you're at the Nixon Library in person.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. You're absolutely correct. We're in the Nixon Library, so we want to welcome everyone to the Nixon Library this morning and afternoon for most of you. I've had the pleasure of participating this week in the conference, and it's been an outstanding conference, and we appreciate the opportunity to participate today. I have to thank Juan Ugardi and Craig Ellefson because they've been the production crew here on site and helping us with this today. But I really want to introduce our speaker for this morning, and it's Dr. Gregory Cumming. He's the Nixon Library resource archivist and staff historian, and he'll be presenting the War Powers Act this morning. So, Greg, it's all yours.
All right. Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. The War Powers Act, I'm going to get started to get some background really quick. The War Powers Act is still very relevant to this very day. At its core, the War Powers Act, sometimes referred to as the War Powers Resolution, is meant as a check on the US president's power to commit the United States to an armed conflict without the consent of Congress. Sounds simple enough. Where we get into some of the difficulties, however, is that the president is the commander-in-chief. He is a leader of our armed forces. However, the Constitution grants Congress the authority to declare war. Where we run into the issues is in the post-World War II period. Prior to World War II, the executive and the legislative branches really did not have or deal with any issues related to the established roles set forth by the Constitution. The major changes occur after World War II, and that's because the United States is now expanding. It's now a major world power, and it's no longer an insular country that's going to pare back. For the first time, the United States is going to expand and maintain its military power following World War II. It's elevated to the point of superpower status, and it has greater involvement overseas. That's a key point because when we get to the situation in Korea and Vietnam, we'll see that in both there's no declaration of war, and in both cases, the United States commits substantial numbers of military forces without a declaration of war that occurred during World War II. So we have first the undeclared war in Korea, 1950 to 53. It's referred to as a police action. It's followed by US military actions in Vietnam. In Vietnam, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution is its justification. Now, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964 happened during the Johnson administration, and it's based in controversy in and of itself. There was a supposed attack on two US ships in the Gulf of Tonkin, the USS Maddox and the Sea Turner Joy. Why this is important is there was a supposed attack from the North Vietnamese. The Johnson administration was looking for a way in which to get legislation passed that would allow it a free hand in Vietnam. This provides that action that they then provide the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. It goes through Congress very quickly. Senate, there's only 2 votes against it. So in its essence, the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution allows the President of the United States the ability to use all means necessary to protect US interests in Indochina. As a result, the United States increases its involvement, its buildup in Vietnam. Congress never declares war, but gives this free pass, this blank check, however you want to call it, but it gives the president the right to continue to add, increase US military forces in South Vietnam. So at this point, Congress, as US reaction turns against the war in Vietnam. By 65, 66, 67, particularly 68, we all know the year of the presidential election. Congress has a mechanism. They do have a mechanism that they can use to extricate the United States from the situation and to prevent this increase in support. What they could do is that they could cut funding. However, that's really not a logical for them at that point. Why would you cut funding to US troops in the field? So that's not going to happen. So they're looking for another mechanism. Okay, we made this mistake with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Mistake was made. How do we then find another way out? This is where we get into the discussion over the War Powers Act. We're not going to cut funding to Vietnam, but how do we prevent? And here's the key: how do we prevent further Vietnams from happening? Because if you were to ask the congressional leaders at that time, they would say, there's no way we'll ever do this again. We're never going to give a blank check. We're never going to give the executive the right to have a war without Congress's input. However, there is the whole Iraqi situation, which they essentially do the same thing once again. But what the War Powers Act represents is an opportunity to right the ship. You have a growing power within the executive. If you're a member of the legislative branch, you're seeing the executive branch become stronger and more powerful. So this is going to be a reaction to what's happening in Vietnam and growing presidential power in the field of foreign policy, and particularly in the use of the US military. So what happens next is that we have a weakened president, a president who is mired in the midst of Watergate crisis. We have the Saturday Night Massacre, in which he orders the Attorney General, who resigns, and then the Deputy Attorney General, who resigns, and finally goes to the Solicitor General to fire Archibald Cox, who was the special prosecutor for the Watergate crisis. This all happens on October 20th, 1973. Why this is important is because on October 24th, a politically wounded President Nixon vetoes the War Powers resolution, stating that it would have a negative impact on the authorities of the president, which are both unconstitutional and dangerous to the best interests of our nation. He's saying no to this, but the problem being is he is mortally wounded politically at this time. On November 7th, 1973, the House voted 284 to 135 and the Senate 75 to 18 to override the president's veto. We see two key historical events at play that led to this override of the veto. An extremely unpopular war in Vietnam, one that was historically unpopular, and then the Watergate crisis. So what began as an American-led war in March of 1965 with the introduction of ground forces using the Gulf of Tonkin resolution as the means, then became a full-fledged US war without a single declaration of war stating this is our national policy and this is where we're going. So we get to the point now, I'm going to go a little bit further, Juan, before the video. When Nixon enters the White House in 1969, congressional opposition to the war had grown and it had festered throughout the nation, but particularly in Congress. Congress, as I mentioned earlier, could choose that as a way to extricate the United States to cease funding for US forces. However, they were already in the field. It would make US forces vulnerable and place them in greater danger. Congress in and of itself would not make that decision to do such a thing in the midst of an actual shooting war. So the easiest way to reassert authority is going to be through the legislative process. So that decision is then coming up with the War Powers Act and negotiating a strategy between the House and the Senate. What will it finally look at like? But the end result that they're trying to achieve, their goal, and it'll be one of the things we look back at in the conclusion, is their goal was to ensure that no future Vietnams would occur, and that the president, the executive, could not move unilaterally to get involved in another case such as Vietnam. So that's where we are at this point. We have the war in Vietnam. We have a critically wounded president who's against the war. What I'd like to do right now is, after leaving the White House and looking back on the War Powers Act, President Nixon had a few things to say. And Juan, if you will please show that video. It's directly from the president himself, his views.
I feel that the War Powers Act put restraints on the president that were unnecessary and too unwise. I think de Gaulle's very famous comment to the effect that parliaments can paralyze policy, they cannot initiate it. The Congress cannot run foreign policy. The Congress can restrain, and it should. The Congress provides the money, and it should hold the purse strings. But as far as decisions are concerned, as far as initiatives are concerned, that's got to come to the president.
So what we're seeing here is that Congress now is pushing because they want to be involved. Consulted is the word that we'll see in the War Powers Act when we get into the details of it. Also, in his memoirs, Richard Nixon referred to the passage of the War Powers Act as Congress's tragic and irresponsible action, which fatally undermined the peace we had in Indochina, and was buried amid the media's preoccupation with John Dean's testimony before the Irvin Committee. And that occurred on June 25th, 1973, the Irvin Committee, the testimony. Now, this also substantiates that Nixon believed that Watergate was also responsible for the ability of Congress to override, not fearing the presidential power, not seeing a president weakened, and seeing Congress trying to reassert their role, their traditional role as within the framework of the American military, use of American military overseas. But they see a weakened president, and this is the opportunity to push back on what's being termed at that time the imperial presidency. Now, some of the key components of the War Powers Act. First, we're in Section 3. A president can send U.S. military into action, but only under certain circumstances without a declaration of war. This had traditionally been the case prior to Korea and Vietnam. You don't have undeclared wars. If we look back, the War of 1812, the Mexican-American War, Civil War, Spanish-American War, in each case, there was a declaration of war. Section 2C, the heart of the resolution, attempts to tie presidential use of force to constitutional considerations. A congressional declaration of war, statutory authorization, or an attack on the U.S. or its territories are the ways in which the U.S. military can be used. The hope here on Congress's side was that the president would consult with Congress in every possible instance. Well, what does that mean realistically? It's the hope that Congress can insert themselves in the process and be part of the process deciding when and where to go to war. And once again, this is all about avoiding future involvement in another Vietnam. It's to avoid this from occurring once again. It's to provide a voice for Congress and to reassert its constitutional role and to say, we are here to declare war. The commander-in-chief, the president, decides how the war will be fought, but it's Congress who decides on the authorization to use those forces. The next section, President must notify Congress. Section 4 requires reporting within 48 hours in the absence of a declaration of war or congressional authorization. It triggers the time limit. When you report to Congress, there's a time limit now that's outlined in Section 5. And in Section 5, U.S. forces must be removed from hostilities within 60 days without congressional authorization. So that once they notify Congress, that time starts clicking and you're on the clock. You need to either get a declaration of war from Congress or authorization for action to be continued. It can be extended for a 60-day period, or it can also be extended if Congress is unable to meet due to an armed attack. So we get into the results. And these numbers are from March of 2019 from a survey done, a research done by the Congressional Research Service, that as of March of 2019, there were 168 instances reported under the War Powers Act. It starts on April 4th of 1975 during that final offensive in South Vietnam, when the North is attacking, and there's the removal of civilians from Da Nang. There are other occasions in which it was invoked. Cyprus, there's invoked 168 times. Iran, the rescue attempt of 1980, in Lebanon during the Reagan administration in 1982, and then Iraq again in 1990 and 91. So you see that the president, the executive branch, doesn't have a major issue in notifying of some of these actions. So we're seeing that by and large, the executive is involved, is reporting as appropriate. However, there are 18 instances when it wasn't invoked. And we begin with the evacuation of civilians from Cyprus in 1974 through a bombing campaign in Iraq, Operation Desert Fox, from December 16th through the 23rd, which was aimed at destroying Iraqi industrial facilities. So there's 18 occasions in which it wasn't invoked. Now, the question is, in its essence, is this constitutional? Now, Congress adopted the resolution in response to the perception that the president had too much authority. Congress is going to use what is called the necessary and proper clause, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. It specifically provides that Congress shall have the power to make all laws necessary and proper for carrying into execution not only its own powers, but also all other powers vested by the Constitution in the government of the United States. So in reality, this can mean almost anything. So what does it mean? I went and talked to a good friend of mine who's a constitutional historian, and he says, well, there's three challenges to this, three components that must be met in order to use the necessary and proper clause. One, I have to admit that I was taken aback by this. One, it has to be necessary. Well, what does one define as necessary? In our current political climate, I don't think you can get a 60% on any action as being necessary. The second is it proper? Well, we would hope that in most cases, Congress would not enact any laws that weren't proper. And then thirdly, the law has to carry into execution some form of federal power. So those are the key components. Now, in the Constitution, great powers for all branches are enumerated in the Constitution rather than implied. Now, this would be more of an implied power. Therefore, one could hope or state then that this is not the scope is not one of a great power. So this is going to be used to implement the War Powers Resolution. Every president since its enactment in 1973 has taken the position that is an unconstitutional infringement on the president's authority as the commander-in-chief. Now, the Constitution allows the president to be the commander-in-chief of all forces, but provides Congress the right to declare war. So I'm not seeing where this conflict of the commander-in-chief. Congress is not telling the commander-in-chief how to use the armed forces, because Congress has the sole authority to commit the U.S. military to war, has the sole authority. So the War Powers Act can be seen instead not as an usurping presidential authority, but trying to take back its lost authority and its traditional role set out by the framers of the Constitution in order to declare war before sending in forces. So in essence, is the War Powers Act constitutional? Is it a legal and binding law? At this point, yes. The judicial branch has yet to weigh in. And when you look, when you study presidential administrations since this enactment, when you go into the national security files, every administration will have a discussion about the War Powers Act and whether or not it is constitutional, it is legal. And every administration states the same thing in different ways. Yes, we don't like it. Yes, we think it's an infringement, but boy, oh boy, we really don't want to send this to court because we are very unsure of what the resolution would be from the judicial branch. We can't control it. We can live with what we have. We can live with the standard that has been set, but we are very unsure of going into a court case and not knowing the resolution. So what we have in our conclusion is essentially an uneasy truce between the branches. The judiciary hasn't weighed in, but the question we have to ask ourselves is, has it worked as intended? We haven't had a court case. Let's go back to the judiciary. We haven't had a court case that will resolve it, that will resolve whether it's constitutional or not. But has it worked as intended? If we look at the fact that there's been no new Vietnams, for example, no major usage of U.S. military forces without the involvement of Congress, then we have to say to a certain extent, it has worked. But one could also then take the devil's advocate role and say it hasn't worked. Why? Because like the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, there was the resolution regarding Iraq that basically gave the blank check once more to the president to do as he saw fit, or he or she would see fit, to react to the terrorist attacks from 9/11. Did it have the same impact that the war in Vietnam had on American society? No, it did not. So in a sense, we have those two issues that counteract each other regarding has it worked as intended. For the most part, I would have to say that yes, it has. But that is where we are today. It's still relevant, still being discussed. You'll still see news articles periodically. Anytime there's a contemplation of sending U.S. military forces, for example, currently right now, Haiti is asking for U.S. assistance in the aftermath of the assassination of their political leader. So the question is, They're requesting U.S. forces, but in order to send the military into Haiti, yes, it would require notification of Congress and the involvement of Congress to send those forces in. At this point, unless anybody else has anything to add, we can open it up for questions. And don't everybody jump in at one time. I guess I was so thorough, Juan.
I think early on, Rocky Parker had a question about the speech.
The Nixon? Which speech?
Rocky, you there?
Yeah. So actually, I didn't have a question. I was just making a comment that interestingly enough, when you go to the LBJ library in the declassified documents, and I was at the archives there in 2012, it's interesting that the speech for the Gulf of Tonkin, this is not involving Richard Nixon's administration or anything, but the speech itself was written in May of 1964. And of course, the event itself has always been very controversial, but I found it extremely interesting that it was specifically the speech, and then you had to fill in kind of the blanks, if you will. Anyway, I enjoyed your presentation. I like the videos post presidential time that he talked about, his comments on the use of the War Powers Act. So actually, it really wasn't, a question per se. It was just a chat comment. Sidebar. Sorry.
The interesting thing, Rocky, you are absolutely correct. The Gulf of Tonkin resolution was actually, they had already formulated, had it ready to go, and it was sitting collecting dust in the NSC, waiting for an action that they could use to then send it to Congress, just like the speech. They had it all wrapped up, ready to go. We're just waiting for something to happen. So I find it very interesting that you found the speech that was written in May, but yet nothing happened until August. But yeah, that's the reality of the situation.
Yeah, interestingly enough, also, the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, if you will, was also doing amphibious raids into the islands all off of North Vietnam during the same period. And, they were raiding these little islands. So the North Vietnamese patrol boats were, were they reacting to the USS Maddox? Or again, were they reacting to these South Vietnamese Marines doing raids into North Vietnamese property or islands? Anyway,
the history is that they were reacting, and the two destroyers that were there they were there operating to determine the North Vietnamese reaction to these raids. How are they reacting? How long does it take them to react? So they were all of these activities are intertwined into one. And it makes it a very interesting situation, because McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, goes on television and saying that the United States was in international waters at the time that this was happening, but yet they were not. So there's a lot of, it's a huge ball that's all wound into one. But
it gave Johnson the authority or whatever to address Congress, and he was up to this time, in 1964, there were still talks about Bobby Kennedy being the Democratic candidate for the presidential in 64, and so as we get through the summer in August, when this occurs, then LBJ can be shown as a strong presidential presidential candidate in the military era, as opposed to being weak, compared to his running, the guy that was opposing him, Goldwater. Anyway, nice job. Good presentation. Thank you.
There was a question, I saw it pop up on U.S. troops being in Vietnam prior to the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. Yes, they were there. They weren't supposedly they weren't supposed to take a combat role. They were there as advisors. Now, it's not until March of 1965 that the United States officially sends in combat troops when the Marines land in South Vietnam. It wasn't until March of 1965, and that's when we have the official date of when the United States begins to take over the war. Famous commandant of the Marine Corps says, Marines aren't going to sit around on their ditty boxes waiting for to be attacked. We're going to go out there and we're going to take it to the Viet Cong. So I love that term. We're not going to sit on our ditty boxes. I have no clue what a ditty box is, but I love the term. Hopefully that answers that question. Somehow I had to get a ditty box in there.
I put a link in the chat. There's been some discussion in Congress about repealing the war authorizations from 2001, 2002. I realize that's out of your time frame, but the House has just approved that. It doesn't look like it'll go anywhere in the Senate, but you never know. I was wondering if you thought about, any of the challenges to that occurred in the 21st century. I know there's been multiple attempts.
The timing is absolutely appropriate. Remember when I said they're not going to revoke it while the troops are in the field. Now, when you essentially have everything taken out, then it's easy. You cut off the funding at that point because casualties can't be laid at your feet. We didn't do this until after we started pulling everybody out. So the timing is absolutely important and critical to what they're doing in the House now. And Lord only knows what's going to happen in the House and Senate these days. I have given up predicting American politics. I will stick with history because I'm really bad on predicting outcomes. I like going backward, not forward. All right. Any other questions? Okay. How did Nixon feel about being a commander in chief? Was he trying to use strength in foreign policy to counteract his domestic challenges with Watergate? Well, let's take Watergate out for right now. Let's just say, was he trying to use strength in foreign policy? Absolutely, from the get-go. But bearing in mind that as commander-in-chief in Vietnam, he was in a no-win situation. He inherits a war that is extremely unpopular. Casualties are still great in 1969, and he's trying to draw down U.S. involvement in Vietnam so that he can focus on other things. What is he focusing on? The opening to China, better relations with the Soviet Union. He has other fish he wants to fry. And Vietnam at that point is sitting and taking up the lion's share of activity that the president has to focus on. So he wants to draw down Vietnam so he can get involved in other activities. Now, in regards to Watergate, you'll see he takes the trip to the Middle East in 1974, just prior to his resignation in the summer of '74. Was he trying to use foreign policy to a certain extent during the crisis? Absolutely. Any president would. I don't see any president who wouldn't want to then focus where they have greater authority and leeway, which is foreign policy, than domestic. It was very difficult during this Watergate era for the president to work with Congress, a Congress that was dominated by the Democratic Party, a Congress that was mired down into investigating the president of the United States over the 1972 campaign and the Watergate break-in. So it would only be natural to then move to an arena in which he had greater opportunity. Now it says from Peggy, there are about 16,000 US military advisors in Vietnam when Kennedy was assassinated. That is correct. They were advisors. They did not have a combat role at this time. So at the time of Kennedy's assassination, yes, there was a marked increase in advisors. You have roughly 300 at the end of the Eisenhower administration and 16,000 at the end of the Kennedy administration. The difference being is now in March of 65, you're sending whole units in. And by the end of 1965, they're taking offensive action. By the end of 66, you have over 100,000 US soldiers in Vietnam. And it increases to the point where we have over 500,000. So 500,000 as opposed to 16,000, you see the difference, entire units going in, entire units going out. So that was the difference. Any other questions? I just love the topic of Vietnam. So you can see I get excited whenever we do this. I teach a class on US involvement in Vietnam. So you guys hit my groove right there. So any other questions? Why did Nixon expand the war into Cambodia? Boy, that is a great question. That is a phenomenal question. One of the reasons, the key reason, had he probably would not have, except for one key component. There were a number of key sanctuaries along the border of Cambodia and South Vietnam that was used by the North Vietnamese. They come down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and they know the United States is not going to go into Cambodia. So they set up these camps. They can cross the border at will. If they get mauled in many cases, they go back across the border, they refit, re-energize, and more troops come in. So Cambodia was a sanctuary to get away from the United States, and that's when you begin the secret bombing that occurs during the Nixon administration, and then the invasion in 1970. The invasion is also seen as an opportunity to see how the South Vietnamese troops will do in a more aggressive action. That yes, they'll have U.S. support, but can they handle going in and aggressively fighting the North Vietnamese on their own? Now, the question is, was it successful or not? And there you'll have a wide variety of opinions. Would he have allowed that action if Cambodia hadn't been going through civil war? There is a great deal of scholarship now stating that U.S. involvement in Cambodia actually increased the strength of the Khmer Rouge fighting against government forces. So what came first, the chicken or the egg? We really it's up to one's viewpoint, one's how they determine. But did it have a negative impact? Yes, you have the overthrow of Prince Sihanouk. You have General Lon Nol come in as the new leader of Cambodia while trying to fight a civil war, and yet you have a very large component of North Vietnamese in your country. So Cambodia at this point was a real mess. The Khmer Rouge is being financed by the Chinese at this point, supported by the North Vietnamese, and as we know famously in '79, the North Vietnamese will turn against the Khmer Rouge.
To interject here, I had a speaker, John Harris, who was one of the commanders that led troops into there. And he talked about how they just kicked the holy hell out of them and how happy his troops were. They had destroyed just tonnage of weapons that were being used to kill. And then they read the reports back in America, and he said it just destroyed morale to find out they had been so successful and then put down in American press.
If you read the accounts, and two books in particular of the soldiers who went in, one's called Charlie Company, the other is Bloods, about African-American troops. They describe going into Cambodia, just as you did, a massive success. They provide numbers. This would prevent the North Vietnamese from attacks, would give, at least 6 months to a year to the South Vietnamese military to build up. And actually the hope was provide a break for the American soldiers who were there and allow Vietnamization to take hold. That was the hope. it's kind of like the Tet Offensive. Yes, it can be successful on the ground, but what's reported at home and how it's taken at home, given the unpopularity of the war, the problem that the Nixon administration had is in order to extricate itself, it had to take actions sort of like the one in Cambodia. That action could lead to quieter times on the front, but yet would be seen by the population of the United States as expanding the war and not seen as an attempt to extricate the United States from the war. So once again, you're seeing that dichotomy, that those opposing entities. What's actually happening? Are we drawing down, or are we getting ourselves involved in another country, in another war? And that's the rub. That is the rub. All right.
Well, thank you.
Any other
Appreciate
questions?
that. Mark, back to you.
Yeah, and I just had a quick question maybe for you, Cliff. Craig had sent me some documents. Are those to share afterwards? Or
Yes.
okay,
As
some resources.
Resource materials, right.
And
So
you can forward people to me too. If they have any follow-up questions, they can email me, and I am always available to talk history anytime, any place, anywhere.
And then you want to talk through those links that you've provided?
Okay.
The first link there is a link to Docs Teach, where through NARA's education staff on the East Coast has put together where you can view in higher resolution the actual text of the War Powers Resolution of 1973, as well as view a transcript of it. It's downloadable, you can print it. You may use it however you wish in your classrooms. Now there's a PDF packet that we scanned from our collections here at the Nixon Library. And I don't recall off the top of my head what they are, but they are, it shows what's going on in the government between the legislative and executive branches during all of this going on with the War Powers Resolution. And the third pack is also, again, from National Archives Education. It's a lesson plan. It's a lesson plan regarding the president, Congress, and the war powers, of how our government conducts war. And it's a lesson plan for grades 10 to 12. And it provides everything that you need right here in this little packet of documents. And we included a link to our Nixon Foundation. We're partners with the private foundation here. As Greg said, feel free to contact us at any time if you have any questions whatsoever, or for reference material. We are here for you.
Thank you, Craig. And I have those documents. So I'll be uploading those a little bit later today as well, along with the materials I added from this morning as well are already online. Any other final questions for any of our Nixon team? I really appreciate Cliff coordinating all of that, Dr. Cummins and Craig, and Juan behind the scenes there with the very jealous of your technology setup there. But thank you all at the Nixon Library. I believe it might be possibly the first or second, maybe the second time. I think Cliff has participated before, but really appreciate the information. Really fits in great with our theme for this year. And as we mentioned with the link there, it's timely to some of the things that are going on in Congress today. And as you've said, each president kind of debates that every time. So any final questions you can type in there. Again, thanks to the Nixon team for that great presentation.